So first of all, before we begin, a welcome to the South Florida Poetry Journal's reading series. This is a special reading because Julie Marie Wade is not only a wonderful author, but also a great friend of South Florida Poetry Journal. And we're so honored to have you here tonight, Julie, to kick off your new book. And the book is called The Merry Years. It's a wonderful cover and a wonderful book. Yes, hold up the book.
I'll hold on to.
There you go. And I'm going to, before we get going with that, I'm going to introduce Michael McInerney, who's here. He's the managing editor of South Florida Poetry Journal, and he's the one who makes all the magic happen with the videos and the website and the journal issues and some of the readings as well. I also want to introduce or send a special welcome to the students who are here. It's always wonderful to have people joining the reading on their own accord, just because they want to hear what's going on. And I think you're going to be very happy when you hear this. And I'll introduce you to Julie, just in case most of you already know Julie, and she doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce her just in case some would like to know. Julie writes and publishes poetry, prose, and hybrid forms. Her most recent and forthcoming collections include The Merry Years, another look at the book, which was published by Texas Review Press in 2024, selected by Michael Martone for the 2023 Clay Reynolds Novella Prize. Quick Change Artist Poems, published by Anhinga Press in 2025, will be published, selected by Octavio Quintanilla for the 2023 Anhinga Prize in Poetry. Fisk by Analogy, Cutbank Prose Chapbook Series 2025, and the latest 20 Guzzles for 2020, published by Harbor Editions in 2025. So you have quite a few books coming out, and the latter one was co-authored with our own favorite Denise Duhamel. Julie was a finalist for the National Poetry Series and a winner of the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir. She teaches in the creative writing program at Florida International University in Miami and makes her home with Angie Griffin and their two cats, who are wonderful to see on your Facebook account all the time in Dania Beach. So welcome, Julie, and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I see so many familiar names and also names I don't know. So this is maybe a chance for some of you, if you don't know anything at all about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I hope this will still be an engaging evening for you. And maybe I've been hearing little percolations from folks who've never seen the show, who've said, well, after you started talking about it or reading about it, I decided I better, look it up. And it's on Hulu, so you can watch it. It's out there. And a lot of it is also available in small clips on YouTube. So Judy had asked me when we were talking about this gathering, this sort of reading and conversation, what I wanted to read, and then she had some ideas and she had some questions. But I thought to get started that I would read two very short sections from near the beginning of the book. One is the beginning of the book, the opening credits. So this is a collection that kind of moves chapter by chapter as essays and episodes, and a lot of course, references to television and use of televisual forms. So the opening credits, if you've seen the Mary Tyler Moore Show, you're going to recognize this montage. If you've never seen the Mary Tyler Moore Show, it might be something that you want to check out, at least the opening credits, to see if your reading of them jives with mine. So these are the opening credits and my interpretation of them. She isn't smiling when it begins. This is important to remember. Her eyes are wide, watchful, and the way she touches her tongue to the roof of her mouth suggests she may be staving off tears. The road ahead unfolds toward the city, two cities, twins, and she must choose between them. Make the right choice, Mary. One city already has a saint. She will become patron of the other, Saint Mary of Minneapolis. Her eyes follow the road, follow the exit signs, but her mind is far away, is flashing back to Roseburg. This is important to remember. The past is always with us, no matter who we are. They threw a party for her, the co-workers at her last job, her friends. We never learn much about that before life, though we know Mary must have been loved. Past's prologue. Past is always prologue, Mary. On CBS in the 70s, as much as in Shakespeare's time. This is important to remember. There's a sign that reads, "Good luck, Mary," but she won't need it. She has her work ethic, her practicality, and her pluck. Someone uncorks a bottle of champagne. Red roses, a parting gift, resemble Miss America's bouquet. And Mary is our Miss America all grown up, isn't she? Or at least our Miss American Midwest. There's joy in the flashback and sadness too, but goodbye is just the shadow of hello. This is important to remember. Mary drives a Mustang after all, hinting at the wild horse within. When we see her next, she's walking, a woman alone in winter, no man steering her by the elbow or warming her with his embrace. Saint Mary of perambulation. It's cold, but she's not daunted by the weather. She strides bare-legged in her knee-high boots, her knee-length coat. She carries her groceries home from the store, a certain spring in her step, a loaf of bread bouncing on top of her brown paper bag. Mary is beginning to smile now, to feel herself part of something larger, subsumed in the corner crowd. She wears a tam or tammy hat, which is a woman's variant of the tam o' shanter worn by men. Mary is like this, pleasant and appropriate, but slyly subversive too. Our Lady of Surprises, Our Lady of more than what she seems. Not the type to draw attention to herself. It takes an extraordinary surge, this independence, this freedom at last, to prompt the twirl, the tossing of her tam into the air. An older woman looks on, envious or admiring, or perhaps recalling a day when she did the same. Saint Mary of maybes, Saint Mary of anything is possible now. We at home have crossed ourselves. We genuflect by screen glow. We will follow wherever she goes. Our Lady of the Smile. And actually, when I drive to work in the summer, I drive past a little church in Hollywood, Florida that's called Our Lady of the Smile, and it always makes me think of Mary, even though I realize it's a different Mary. So the other small section that I'm going to read is just a tiny contextualizing part of how Mary came into my life. The Mary Tyler Moore Show ran on CBS from 1970 until 1977, and I was born in 1979. So obviously, I was not a first-run viewer, but I was the child of a sort of unusual family in that my parents were both children of the 1940s, and they had come of age in the 1950s, and they watched really exclusively 1950s television and films and listened to 1950s music and even earlier shows and music. And so I was growing up in the 1980s, but I was really growing up in the 1950s. Like everything I was consuming popular culture wise was, sort of a Leave It to Beaver kind of situation. And this worked well because in 1985, the TV station, classic TV station, Nick at Night, launched. And my parents felt like, well, we know this is good quality television because it's mid-century. And so I was watching, always shows that were in black and white. And in 1992, when I was 12, going on 13, one of the very first color shows ever came to Nick at Night, and it was the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And so for me, even though, I was technically a teenager in the 1990s, the Mary Tyler Moore Show of the 1970s was really, really contemporary for me. It felt like the newest, freshest thing I had ever seen. And it started to just unlock a lot of doors in my imagination that hadn't been unlocked before. And I really hadn't ever seen a woman at the center of a story. The exception was the Donna Reed show, but Donna Reed was really defined as a wife and a mother and only someone operating in the domestic sphere. So to see a woman who was also going to work and a woman whose story begins with her leaving a fiance and moving to a big city all by herself, just kind of a radical notion. I hadn't seen anything like that before. So this is a little glimpse of what that was like for me. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Mary Moore who often appeared uncredited in bit movie parts and TV commercials. Julie Wade understood how it felt to be such a girl. She was starring uncredited in her own life story. One day, the aspiring actress decided she needed to distinguish herself with a memorable middle name. She took her father's, the Tyler from George Tyler Moore, which Julie Wade admired because it struck a chord of pleasing androgyny. More girls should embrace the boys in them, she thought, the way Moore did, and smiled at the pun. Although Julie could not see the boy in Mary, she knew he was there, shadowing her first name like the fletching on an arrow. And it was not long before Mary Tyler Moore made her three-named debut in a sitcom. Granted, the sitcom bore someone else's name, a man, similarly tripartite, called Dick Van Dyke, but perhaps that too was part of the premonition, her own eponymous story on the horizon. Julie Wade stopped to consider the formal nameplate on her bedroom door. Until this time, she had only been called Julie Marie Wade as a harbinger of trouble. Until this time, she had only written her first and last, her given and sir, on the upper left corners of her papers at school. Now she wondered what would happen if she resolved to occupy more space, to fill herself in, to flesh herself out, the way Mary Tyler Moore had done, and in so doing to move toward a feature role in the narrative already underway. Shake that snow globe a few times now. Can you see me at 12, going on 13, my head bowed resolutely over the blank page? No, I am not praying. The snow is not even snow, but paper I have torn up, confetti I have made of my own mistakes. Is this celebration, invocation, both? It is hard to say. I write Mary Tyler Moore in my ledger, then count the letters that add up to 14. On the line below, I write Julie Marie Wade and count again. These letters also add up to 14. I blink at them hard, at their mystical symmetry. Mary Tyler Moore, Julie Marie Wade. We are both three names now, 5 syllables, 14 letters. Mary and I occupy the same space on the page. I begin to chant us as if I am casting a spell. For all my life thereafter, I will make my mark this way, claiming everything I resolve, sparing nothing. And I will recall the way the camera zoomed swift and bird-like through the upper left corner of the M in her name before swelling to full-size picture again. There is Mary behind the wheel. There is Julie, unseen but present beside her. So I will stop there for a minute and see. I know Judy has some other passages that she requested, but you might have other things that you want to say or ask too.
Anybody who would like to ask a question, if you want to unmute and ask it, you can. Or if you are not wanting to speak it, you can always put it into the chat, and we'll make sure that we get a chance to answer that. I know, Julie, you'd said that you wanted to talk a little bit about televisual ekphrastic writing and memoir writing and how those two kind of blend together in this book.
Absolutely. So Kate, who's in the audience tonight, remembers that there's a unit in my creative nonfiction class called Writing the Arts. It's too short, it should be its own class, but we try to fit everything we can into a survey. But I am really excited about the ways that I keep seeing more and more ekphrastic possibilities emerging. And I guess in some ways this book is wanting to be a part of that kind of movement that I see happening in literature. And I wasn't consciously thinking, I want to write an ekphrastic or a televisual ekphrastic project to be part of this like feeling of a movement in contemporary literature. But after writing The Merry Years in 2017, I think it sort of like activated my receptors for noticing other projects that were book length and really focused on writing the arts and not just the classical arts. So usually with my students, I find that if they know the word ekphrasis, it's the Greek word for description. And we usually encounter it in a poetry class, right? Where we're reading the most familiar example is usually John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, and you have this sense of this very serious young poet, sitting in the British Museum contemplating the Grecian urn, and then writing this very, very elegant, versed account, a sort of, really ornate description of the Grecian urn. And there's a lot of beauty and merit in that. But then I realized that my own sort of ekphrastic education stayed in the poetic space, and it usually was more kind of canonical poets writing in response to like art that would appear in a gallery or a museum. So like older art. And I started realizing that more and more, and maybe it's always been there, but it's like that thing, once you see it, you stop being able to unsee it. Noticing more and more projects that are using television and film and just popular cultural texts. And I have students who are writing like about video games and about music videos and about visual novels and other things that feel very like of our zeitgeist and our time. So like you can be writing about something that, coexists in your own era rather than always like an ekphrastic sensibility that's looking back at art from another time. And so right now, in part because, you're revisiting your work in your newest book and you're reading from it, I'm thinking a lot about ekphrastic work, but also wanting to like recommend to others that sometimes if there's a kind of like a text, like, and it doesn't have to be high art, so called, but a text that you're really passionate about, you might not automatically consider it as subject matter for your writing. And so now it feels like, 25 years, I loved the Mary Tyler Moore Show emphatically before I wrote this book. And I'm realizing I want to give like more invitations to my students and to other people to think about like what is the TV show or the film or the pop cultural text that you basically can't stop talking about, or that everybody who knows you is like, oh my God, going to go on about that now. Maybe that's the thing that also is going to come to your work in a way that really animates it because you're so passionate about it. And sometimes I find that in that moment in the class, it's like this new permission, like, oh my goodness, I can actually, it's okay to write about, that movie that I've seen 50 times and that I put on every time I'm sad, or it's okay, to write an essay that looks at my favorite playlist, and, oral ekphrasis, like the music that shapes our lives, like, yes, you can do that. And it's really fulfilling to do. So I'm kind of hoping that the Mary years, whether people are fans of the show or not, might be an invitation to step into more ekphrastic work. And it can be prose as well as poetry, which isn't always like immediately apparent to us, I think, when we first learn about ekphrastic work. Oh, and there might be a comment here. Or a question. Zara, what inspired you to write this book? Well, I wrote the book. It doesn't necessarily, I guess, feel like an elegy in the sense that I guess maybe we assume elegies feel sad or feel mournful. But I did want to write this book after Mary Tyler Moore died. She passed away at the beginning of 2017. And it happened to be a day that I was teaching a back-to-back class schedule. And I usually don't teach like a 3-hour class and then only have a 10-minute break in between and then teach another 3-hour class. So it was a very sort of unusual semester. And it's written in the book, but I wrote it near the end because it's part of the kind of arc of the story. But I realized that the way that that day ended with finding out that Mary Tyler Moore had died, but having spent all that time with my students, and we were even working on ekphrastic writing in my multi-genre intro class at the time, so many pieces kind of came together. So I felt like I have to write this. I have to write some kind of homage and elegy to this person and her body of work, and particularly her eponymous show. And so I was inspired to write it like in a way that I always knew I would maybe write something about her, but then at the time of her passing, it felt like, okay, I have to commit to that. And I wasn't consciously thinking, I've got to do an ekphrastic thing, but there was no way not to do an ekphrastic thing when I was trying to kind of trace what she had meant to me. So that's a really good question. Thank you. Sandy wrote, maybe you're talking about this right now, and can you talk about the necessity for you to occupy more space by writing about more? Why is this so critical to you at this point in your life? Well, the weird thing about writing memoir, but also the joy of writing memoir, is that you figure so many things out looking back that, you think later, like, oh, that should have been so obvious. Like realizing that I went through that sort of ritualistic, oh, she took her father's middle name and I can use my middle name. But in the moment, when you're not writing it, I mean, I was writing our names, but when you're not writing it and reflecting on it, you don't always realize what that really meant. Until you look back at it. So I knew there was something powerful and exciting. And I had been reading when I was, 12, 13, I started reading everything I could about Mary Tyler Moore and reading biographies and interviews. And so that's how I found out about everyone saying her name was so ordinary, like just Mary Moore, that it was kind of a forgettable name and that she should probably do something to distinguish herself. And so then the fact that she chose to put that Tyler in there, like I thought that was just really fascinating. But in retrospect, I think is when I understood that it was also like, I can use the whole thing. I can take up the whole space. I can put my whole name on the page and it doesn't have to be like a chiding, Julie Marie Wade, you're in trouble now kind of use of my name. And that we just had choices like that. That was very like radical for me at that age, but also radical in rediscovering like, oh, that's why I started doing that and why it's all three of my names now on this book. Um, Zara says, does the setting relate to any parts of how you see the way character or maybe characters are described in the story, or like how setting relates to character? That's always a really good question. In this book, um, in order to kind of trace the 25 years of my own history from 1992 to 2017, watching the show, obviously I'm still watching it, but the book had to be written at a certain moment in time. But I used setting, and I had so much fun with this, but what I had the most fun with was seeing what my publishers did with place in terms of the visuals that are in this book. They're really incredible. Like I didn't submit this manuscript with any of the visuals that are now in the book. That is all the work of the amazing people at Texas Review Press. But in sort of trying to map my life alongside the character of Mary Richards, which I was always doing, and I think we do that when we're fans, like we see, like, how do I relate to this character? How am I similar? So I knew that Mary was from this fictional town. I mean, in her character's life, it's a real town, but Roseburg, Minnesota isn't a real place, but Minneapolis is. So even that felt kind of significant to me, that she's coming from this place that nobody really knows anything about and nobody can really find out anything about because it's imaginary. And I come from this little tiny place inside of Seattle, Fontley Hills, which is very, very beautiful, but very insular. And so there's something that like, it also feels a little like a fictional town because when people think of Seattle, they think of, I think a very progressive place, which is kind of, like a sort of liberal culture. And I remember being in a film studies class in grad school, and we were watching a film that had been set in Seattle, and the teacher said, well, these are like typical Seattle yuppies. You can see that reflected in the landscape. And I was like, I didn't know any typical Seattle yuppies when I was growing up. That was like not my world at all. And so my book is really, it is centered around setting in a way. So it's Fontley Hills was my Roseburg is the first section. And then my first job experience was working for a now sadly defunct West Coast chain of department stores called Lamont's. So I have Lamont's might have been my WJM. Really, my WJM is FIU, it turns out, where I work now. But when I was getting my first, proper job that wasn't like babysitting or mowing lawns, it felt very official. And so I was like, this is it. This is where I meet the people who are going to mentor me. And they did. And then the next section is Pittsburgh was my Minneapolis. So in real life and real city terms, moving across the country to a new place, a real place. Pittsburgh was my, moving to the big city. And then the final big section of the book is called Miami is my Tipperary. I live in Dania Beach, which is a little north of Miami, but I teach and work in Miami. And at the end of the Mary Tyler Moore show, for folks who are fans, the entire cast sings this song. It's a long way to Tipperary. And it's a very like poignant ballad, and a little bit of it is recreated in the book. But when you start out in the tiny upper corner of the country, and then you end up down at the other polar opposite end of the country that's different in almost every way, that feels as long a distance as it's a long way to Tipperary to end up in Miami. So actually, that is a very astute question. The setting was really guiding, like a way to tell the arc of the story with all of my moves. Lived now it turns out in 5 different states. So I guess the book is sort of mirroring and moving through those settings. Those are all really good questions. Where did you get the inspiration to describe the character? I think just years of obsessive fandom, just years of, journaling, writing a fan letter, a huge fan letter to Mary Tyler Moore, and then Xeroxing it obsessively so I would have a copy of it as well. And I have her autographed picture response still on my wall. So it's like looking at me right now. So it almost was like not inspiration, but years of like study, like almost studying Mary Tyler Moore and the Mary Tyler Moore Show like a subject in school. Like I'm in a permanent independent study with the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And so, everybody I assume has something that is like an enduring, even if we don't talk about it as a fandom in particular, like something like that where the inspiration doesn't even feel like inspiration. It's just a constant touchstone or a frequent touchstone. Did your students give ideas on how the book should come out to be? I don't think any of my students knew I was writing this book because I wrote it in the summer. And so it was kind of a surprise even to me that it was a book. I thought it would just be a long essay of tribute, and then it just kept getting bigger and bigger. So actually, I didn't tell teachers have very secret lives, right? Like we might allude to things that we're doing in our own work, but the class is really for our students. So, I find my students don't always know anything about what I'm working on until like an event like this, or there's a book launch, or there's something going on, and then I can invite them. But it does have a weird self-masking quality about it. Like I'm letting them know I'm also writing, but usually they don't know the particulars of that until there's something in the world. And Sandy asks, what did you write to MTM in that 54-page letter? I did not excerpt it. It was wide ranging and it was, I haven't reread it in a long time, but of course, like blushworthy now. It was very enthusiastic, like dangerously so. And I am known for my enthusiasm now, but like, put like teenage intensity onto that. But I do remember that it is in the book that my best friend and I ran a neighborhood newspaper for 5 years. We sold subscriptions. It's called the Fauntleroy Gazette. And so I included an issue like of the magazine or the newspaper for Mary. And then I included like little awards because our newspaper would give these awards, and they were all it was so weird, but I guess it matched our subscribers were all much older than we were. And we were like the only kids in this neighborhood. So it probably actually wasn't weird to them, but we would give all these awards and prizes that, in our newspaper, which carried no monetary value whatsoever. But we would give all these awards to like movie stars and TV stars and like best at this, best at that. And so I remember a lot of the letter was about telling Mary Tyler Moore how she like won in every category, like all the time, constantly. And it's like, of course she did, because we were running this paper and this was like the only show that we were obsessed with. So that was very silly. But I did, it was like, here's the newsletter, and now you can see, all these awards. And I mean, of course, this is the person who's been like nominated for an Oscar and received countless Emmys, but I wanted her to know that the Fauntleroy Gazette was really recognizing her. And I was trying to tell her what her show meant to me, but I'd only been a viewer for like a year at the time. So I like to imagine that she sent this autographed picture out of true generosity of spirit, but also maybe hoping that it would prevent me from sending another 54-page letter, because I'm sure it was a lot to receive. But yes, more personal than an Emmy. And, in a way, maybe that letter was, trying to articulate something 1 year in that this book is trying to articulate, at the time of writing, 25 years in. But, my editors were so lovely. And I remember saying to them, it would be so cool, like if we could just do this. there's 168 episodes of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Do you think we could get this to fit on 168 numbered pages? And they did it. So that's not even something that a person has to know, but I know. And now you know. And so when I got the book, when I first got it in Digital Galley, scrolling to look at the page numbers and how they had done it, because they'd included all these beautiful visuals and section breaks. And so those aren't all paginated. And so just the way that they did it so that it's 168 pages of text, and that when you get to the closing credits and you're literally ready to close there's acknowledgments, of course, and gratitude after that, but where the actual text of the book ends is on 168. So even that attention to detail is, so meaningful to me. And they were, just so supportive of those little flourishes. Like, I feel like that should happen if it possibly can. And then they didn't say another word about it. They just did it, which was amazing to me because they knew I would know.
That is amazing. I don't see any more questions. So what I would like to ask, if you would, is to read the chapter called The First Interview. You mentioned going for the first job interview, and I just think that's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And if you would read that for us, I would appreciate it.
I will gladly read The First Interview. This is, very authentically how I felt when I, at 17, got a job interview at Lamont's, and I was going in and I assumed that it was going to be very much like the job interview that opens the Mary Tyler Moore Show. The second scene of the whole series is Mary, she's come to this new city and now she needs to find a job. And so I thought this was going to be, my WJM moment. So it's from the Lamont's might be my WJM section, but of course it never turns out quite like it does in television. So here we go. The first interview. I wore a purple pantsuit and the pumps of a much older woman. On my lapel, an angel holding a small Swarovski crystal ball. This was a gift from Grandma June for high school graduation. I know how much you like that angel show, she smiled. I wanted to say, don't remind me. I wanted to say, I don't need Roma Downey and her pretty hands and Irish brogue getting in my way today. And that was a little bit of contemporary culture I was allowed to view because it was about angels. The store was called Lamont's, and it had been operating in Seattle since 1970, the same year the Mary Tyler Moore Show premiered. I considered this fact a most auspicious omen. My parents, who once described their own love story as a whirlwind retail romance, met at Sears in 1963. My father was a manager in training, my mother a college student recently hired as a sales clerk in shoes. It took more than 3 years of courtship before they actually tied the knot, so I always raised my eyebrows at the whirlwind part. Shouldn't I apply to work at Sears? I asked. Isn't it a proud family tradition or something? It's too far to drive, they replied in unison, which meant they had probably discussed the prospect before. Too far in this case meant 7 miles with no highway traffic or difficult merging, really just a straight shot up 35th Avenue to the West Seattle Junction. Lamont's, however, was easily walkable from home, and by car only a swift 5 minutes away. Someone could always pick me up or drop me off without too much inconvenience, since I didn't have a car of my own. The store belonged to a little island of commerce called Westwood Village, where we had shopped for everything: clothing, groceries, hardware, stationery, toiletries, for as long as I could remember. I knew Lamont's, and though I was never a fan of shopping, particularly with my mother, I favored the store for nostalgic reasons. The way they had preserved the past so completely, they might as well have called it Pompeii. That is, inside Lamont's, it was still 1970. And until the day the doors closed forever, following a second bankruptcy, it was always 1970 inside Lamont's. The original carpets, frayed and stained, worn completely bald in places so bits of floor peeked through, retained their bodacious orange and yellow patterns. The fitting rooms retained their built-in ashtrays, and despite the no smoking signs added to each entrance, some customers had been known to light up out of habit while trying on nightgowns or slacks. Once I found a stubbed out Pall Mall still smoldering in the ladies' sportswear fitting room. The lipstick was so fresh that the culprit couldn't have made it farther than the London Fog display. The restrooms were huge, like mausoleums, with a lounge full of mauve couches and garish mirrors that visitors passed through on their way to the stalls. On the counter, I ogled a translucent bowl of potpourri, larger than an eagle's nest, perfuming the room with its deluge of cinnamon and cloves. Oh, yes. And in the jewelry department, an actual disco ball dangled from the ceiling. I imagined the after hours parties where surely Lamont's hired a DJ and all the employees danced. But these were regular business hours on a Thursday afternoon, and someone had to page Larry Bodmer 3 times before the slight middle-aged man appeared on the selling floor and escorted me into his office. Could he be my Lou Grant? I wondered. His black hair had thinned to greasy threads, and the worst kind of comb-over was in play. Would he pour himself a cup of coffee, then slyly mix it with liquor from his bottom drawer? Would he be gruff with me, but simultaneously tender? Would we have witty repartee culminating in his assessment that I had spunk? Remember, my neighbor warned, that doesn't mean the same thing today as it did then. Mr. Bodmer looked, to say the least, bedraggled. He grunted as he reviewed my resume, then set his glasses down on the desk and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. So how long, reasonably, do you think you'll stay? Well, I'd like to work full-time in the summers and over holidays, and I could even work part-time on busy weekends during the academic year. I'm going to college in the fall, but I won't be very far away. College, he nodded. That's good. Where? Pacific Lutheran University, I said softly. This was the school where my grandfather had sent my father his junior year as punishment for having too much fun at the University of Washington. There were no frat houses at PLU, no athletic teams to speak of, and at the time, no dances or social clubs. It was a school where students were expected to concentrate on their studies and where free time was filled with chapel and choir. I was most embarrassed about the Lutheran part. But somehow at this disclosure, Mr. Bodmer brightened. Terrific. Are you interested in the seminary at all? The seminary? I'm a deacon myself, he said, but I'd like to work as a minister full time. Granted, I've been saying that for the last 20 years, but one day, God willing, I'm getting out of this place. So you wouldn't say that retail is your calling? At this, he snorted. No, I would say that retail is my cross to bear. I noticed with some chagrin that there were no pictures of Larry Bodmer as a young football star lining his stark paneled walls. There was no old-fashioned coffee pot quietly perking or classic brown mug made in a daughter's pottery class, just a name tag, a notepad, and a Jesus fish used as a paperweight. So maybe he wasn't Lou Grant exactly, but that didn't mean I couldn't be Mary Richards. I'll do a really good job, I promise. Both my parents worked in retail. That's how they met. And my dad went on to manage several Sears stores after that. Larry folded his hands on the desk, then cracked his knuckles one by one. It doesn't look like you have much work experience, though I am intrigued by this little newspaper you ran. As if taking cues from a stagehand, I slid toward him the final issue of the Fauntleroy Gazette. Just in case you'd like to see it, I smiled. He put his glasses back on, wet his thumb, and flipped through. Horoscopes, huh? That's a little witchy. Oh, my friend wrote those. They're not meant to be taken too seriously, and we don't mess with Ouija boards or anything. Well, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, he said, and I perked up at the gruffness such a statement seemed to portend. We get a lot of nuts in here. Shoplifting is on the rise, and I can only offer you minimum wage. But if that sounds like what you're looking for, put away a little money for school, get some experience working a register, interacting with the public, then you'll be fine. Maybe your next job can even be halfway decent. So what you're saying is, if you don't like me, you'll fire me. And if I don't like you, you'll fire me, I grinned, hoping he would recognize the reference. But instead, Mr. Bodmer's forehead creased and he rubbed his eyes again. Finally, he said, well, if you don't like me, just keep it to yourself. Everyone else does. And if I don't like you, it won't be a problem, unless you show up late or start stealing from the till. Oh, I was just quoting from, never mind. I stood up and stuck out my hand. I strained my dimples to offer my widest smile. Thank you, Mr. Bodmer. I will gladly accept this position, and I promise you won't regret hiring me. He squinted as he stood, touched my hand lightly, replied, "You can just call me Larry. We're not that formal around here." So that's how it started. And I was there for 4 years. And then sadly, they became Gottschalk's, a new store, and they fired me. So kind of like the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but different too.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Before I ask you to read the last pieces that we talked about you reading, I just wanted to ask another question about how you handled the risk in creating this book. As an author, you really, like in that chapter, you just really put yourself out there and what happened in such a open way. Um, you took a risk in writing the book because many of your readers may not even know who Mary Tyler Moore was or what the show was about. But you handled that brilliantly by putting in the cast and little caricatures of them and all that kind of information. And the book is very formally unconventional, brilliantly so. And so the organization of the writing was a risk, but even more so, I think personally, it had to be a risk because you really give your life story to all of the readers. And how did you get to the place where you could do all that and handle the risk of it?
It didn't. I really appreciate that question, and we had talked about this a little bit beforehand. And so I was trying to think about it in advance, like how did it feel risky? And it didn't so much feel risky to me writing it as just necessary. And I think sometimes maybe that's also just another gift of ekphrastic writing is you look out to look in, right? And so memoir, sometimes, I mean, I teach memoir to folks who are already writing it and sometimes to folks who have never imagined writing it. And sometimes people come into a creative nonfiction space and memoir is kind of like the most familiar and often the most popular kind of creative nonfiction. But for some, it feels like very daunting and very risky immediately, and like you're very exposed. And it's not that you're not, but it's that there are lots of tricks to sort of mitigate that. And I guess as you play with all of them over years, you can kind of forget that they're also tricks to trick you out of feeling like self-conscious about the risk that you're taking. But it is a gift of ekphrastic writing, or also other kinds of researched writing that we can do. Like we don't always think of ekphrastic writing as researched because maybe it's something we've been studying most of our lives by choice, and so it doesn't feel like work. But then you realize like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of research that goes into being a fan of something because you're always wanting to learn more about that something or that someone. But it's the being able to focus in part on the person or the art piece or the research that you've done on a subject that fascinates you. I think that that's the biggest trick in making the risk not feel so risky, because I was thinking in writing this book, I've written a lot of memoir. I've written, in the self-referential arts for most of my adult life. And so in a certain way, it's like a growing comfort with like putting yourself on the page. But strangely for me, because I'm not usually a very linear writer, I'm much more of a thematic and associative writer. So it's like usually when I'm writing, and maybe this is why it feels different to you, Judy, because you know a lot of my work and we've talked before, is that instead of it being like finding small glimpses in memory that are all anchored around a common theme, like how many lyric essays are structured, and I love the lyric essay so much and that kind of associational pattern and, recursive structure. But this is really linear. And for many folks, like the linear approach is, like sort of like, well, how else would you tell a story? This happened and then this happened and then this happened. But oddly enough, that's not how I tell a story typically. And so for me, it felt very different, though not necessarily risky, to just say like, okay, well, when did this sort of relationship with the character of Mary Richards begin? Oh, well, that's easy, 1992 when it came to Nick at Night. And then moving forward through time and realizing how like the show was kind of always playing in my life. Like I watched it recreationally, and I'm not really a passive viewer of anything or passive reader. So I was always like, annotating and journaling and, studying, and then going to the library and getting more information about the people in the shows and their histories. And so like building this some kind of body of knowledge around the show, but I'd never thought of structuring my own life in a linear way, the most obvious way, and yet. And so having the show there is like, how did this help me? How is this a touchstone in high school and in college and for all of my jobs? Because it was a big touchstone for jobs, since, Mary Richards was this, sort of iconic career woman, and learning how she moved through. And I really wanted to be able to support myself through my work. And that felt really important and really different from the shows that I had seen, where it was usually not a woman working outside of the home, or really like having her own money, or earning her own paycheck, or feeling like her own self-sufficiency in that way. So I realized like, oh, this was a touchstone all the way through. And so it helps, I think, with the exposure of memoir, to be able to toggle between yourself and another text or another person. And in this case, it just felt really natural, because she'd been, shadowing me, and I'd been shadowing her for so long, but also I'd never written about that. So anywhere else in my memoir life, there are little, moments where Mary Tyler Moore inevitably comes up, but not in a sustained way. And just realizing that I could make that the through line of a book, was really liberating. And I think it made all the risk taking a lot easier. And also, I think it's easier as you get older, but I think you can practice it when you're younger. Just like, you have to have a sense of humor about like who you were too. And I can hear my 17-year-old self like going in there like 2 octaves higher than I am now, and just being like, yes, I'm going to quote lines from the show. I'm going to have this repartee with this man. Like I can hear it. So I feel that, like a tenderness for her, but also an awareness that, she was completely over the top. So like being able to kind of like, I think distance and age can also help like, capture yourself at earlier times, authentically, and with, like if you can laugh at yourself, then you can take the risk.
Thank you so much for answering that. I think you handled everything beautifully, and I still think it's courageous, what you did, putting it all out there. And I really think many people are gonna get a lot of enjoyment out of reading it. I wonder if you would share with us the first section of the chapter called "The Merry Years."
As well. I think this is on 127, and I guess maybe I should say that the title of the book, The Merry Years, when you read it, not too far in, you'll know what it means, but it's idiosyncratic, in that the Mary Tyler Moore Show ran for 7 years, and each year the character, Mary Tyler Moore herself, was almost 3 years older than Mary Richards, but the character of Mary Richards was 30 when the show began and 37 when the show ended. And it was also really candid. It wasn't like, oh, we must hide her age because she's a woman. Her age was referenced in every season, like, it's a year older. And so, and there was nothing sort of like shaming about a woman growing older. In the early episodes, there's actually the second episode, Today I'm a Ma'am, where she realizes that she's in a new demographic, and that people have started calling her ma'am instead of miss. And there's this kind of like shift, like she's suddenly older. And so when I was an early viewer of the show, and I got my best friend April watching the show as well, we just started talking about our Mary years all the time. And people would say like, what do you mean? And we would say, oh, that's when you're between 30 and 37. And these are like really important years in your life, where obviously, you're going to have this epic career, and you're going to have like all these epic romances and adventures. And so we were sort of staking like the Mary years. Most people were like looking to the, right in front of them, like their teenage years or their 20s. But I was sort of always looking at those as like the primer for the Mary years. Like, what would I have to do in my teens and 20s to like get ready to have truly epic Mary years? So then, of course, if you've got like an 18-year build up to that, then that has to be in the book. And that's also the title of the book. But this is how that part of the book, where I've then at that point reached 30, begins. And I should say that in 2017, when Mary Tyler Moore passed away, I was 37. So I was at the end of my Mary Richards years, my Mary years, and people who knew me sent me messages at that time saying like, I'm so sorry that your married years ended with the death of Mary Tyler Moore, but in a certain way, it felt like very symbolic. Like now I have to figure out, who to be when I'm 38, and now I'm 45. So I'm still, you got to keep figuring out all kinds of things always. But those married years, for me, they really lived up to, all of that, that I had put on them all those years, but were very different from Mary's years. So this is how this begins, the married years. In my 30th year, Mary Tyler Moore turned 73, the inverse of her symbolic 37. She publishes a second autobiography titled Growing Up Again, and the phrase blossoms as I turn it over on my tongue. What is there to do but grow up again and again? In this cyclical world, we keep finding ourselves at new starting lines, no matter how far into the distance we have already run. Consider that I began watching The Mary Tyler Moore Show and reading the Mary Tyler Moore story nearly 2 decades before. Consider that I have carried these women like two halves of the same heart alongside my own heart all these years. Consider that the heart is heavy. Even when it is light, the heart is heavy. Consider that at the conclusion of the series to which she had given her name, Mary Tyler Moore teetered on the brink of becoming Mary Richards, single after her second divorce, childless after the death of her son, a shadow version of the woman she had spent so many years portraying, now a decade older and steeped in deeper griefs. It was another starting line, and this time she would have to run toward the future, knowing precisely what she had lost. Consider that at the conclusion of my proto-Mary years, these words from Mary Tyler Moore were posted on my bulletin board, included in my email signature line. I'm not so fearful anymore. I've already seen the darkness. MTM had seen more darkness than MR, for all her empathy and compassion could have imagined. I wondered if there were times she envied the character that she had played.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that there may be people with more questions, but before we open it up for the final question and answer session, would you please read for us the closing credits?
I promise this isn't a spoiler because it kind of has a like a recursive quality to it after all. So closing credits, and hopefully an analog to what you heard at the beginning. I was smiling when it began, hamming it up in all my baby pictures. The shift happened slowly. A melancholy tinge appears around the edges of old photographs, the white borders where they write in the names. There's something called Throwback Thursday now. We post pictures of earlier selves, earlier lives on Facebook, like this one. I'm 5 years old, just fitted for my first glasses, and I clutch the book in my hand like a raft, like I've been drowning, or like I expect to be. Then I'm downcast in the fancy dresses, paraded around by my mother in the neighborhood fashion show. My eyes are closed in all the pictures at Bible school. Then I'm Velma from Scooby-Doo for Halloween, in the orange turtleneck sweater with a magnifying glass. April is Daphne. Our smiles are real. I'm a character in search of a script until I put on a pair of my mother's bell-bottom jeans, the faded pink shirt with the beaded peacock, a rainbow headscarf. Then I'm Rhoda. I'm happy. I'm making somebody laugh. Or I'm Mary with my hair bobbed and a polyester shirt from a thrift store that cinches at the waist with little red buttons all the way down. I still have that. Later, I'm on a date with a man, then another man, and I'm trying to smile, but you can see the hesitation at the corners of my mouth. I'm fitting somebody for a shoe at the store, and I like the idea of being the prince so much more than being Cinderella. Then there's a wedding dress in the back of the car, a bit of the white skirt dragging. I'm smiling because I skipped out. I'm smiling because Angie is driving and no one is watching too close as we sail off into the sunrise, east toward new starting lines. But later, I'm weeping on a therapist's couch where no one takes a picture, where no one would ever dare. I'm telling him that most people don't have to give up their parents when they find true love, exchange one family for another. He wants me to take a good look at myself in the mirror. I watch the Mary Tyler Moore Show instead. He wants me to make peace with the parts of my past I can neither change nor reclaim. I write about the Mary Tyler Moore Show for a TV analysis class. He wants me to contemplate, not to force, but to contemplate the idea of closure. Then my Aunt Linda dies. Then my Grandma June dies. Funerals come too late, but there are no funerals for them. My parents move south to another state, start a new life in the face of the shame I have wrought. Yet here I am smiling at my students as they read their poems aloud. It is not forced. Here I am smiling with my whole face and also my eyes, the day Angie and I stand before a makeshift altar in the Black Cat restaurant and bar. And here I am even smiling in the ER with my leg in a cast. Someone comments, "You're resilient, you'll bounce back." And here I am, one early morning in Minneapolis, when the April rain is turning to snow, and I haven't run anywhere in almost 6 months. I put my uneasy foot into my new running shoe, lace it myself. The ankle is swollen still, but the shoe fits well enough. And then I'm running, and Angie is running beside me, and this time we won't stop until we reach the statue they've erected in her honor, until I am standing breathless at her bronzed foot while Angie snaps the picture. These are my merry years, after all, and I'm smiling like I have some idea where I'm going.
Truly amazing. If anybody would like to unmute yourselves and give a round of applause for Julie, we'd love to hear it in real life.
Thanks, Judy.
Amazing, amazing.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible. And
My pleasure.
reading the book, but hearing it come alive in your voice is even better. So thank you. Do we have any last minute questions or comments that you would like to make before we end our evening?
Julie,
Judy.
how did you reconcile the MTM on the Mary Tyler Moore Show with other of her characters? Oh, that's a good question. Say the mother in Ordinary People. Well, I think that's actually, really fitting because there's a part in this book where I talk a little bit about the fact that I'm sort of marveling at most of us, if we know Mary Tyler Moore from her prolific life on screen, we do tend to focus on the Dick Van Dyke Show from the 60s and the Mary Tyler Moore Show from the 70s. And when the Mary Tyler Moore Show ends, Mary Tyler Moore's 40. And when Mary Tyler Moore died, she was 80. And so sometimes I think about, especially now that, I wrote this at the end of my own, like the very tail end, like the week before I turned 38, I was finishing this book. So it like sort of the what comes next, like what's after the Mary years. And I mean, in a certain sense, they're arbitrary, right? Like your own period of unprecedented growth and change, but then like what comes after. And so I was thinking again, sort of that paralleling of like Mary Tyler Moore has half her life left to live when that show ends. It's not like her life is over because that show ended. And those of you who know Ordinary People, it's a 1980 film. So it's only like 3 years after the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And it was really shocking to a lot of fans because, it's a character where she is not smiling, where she's, extremely repressed and controlling. And there are elements of the character of Beth in that show that they remind me of my mother a little bit. Like her personality is very different. She's a colder, and my mother is a hotter temperament. But it was definitely realizing that she could bring the sadness and the pain that had happened in her own life, and that I had spent a lot of time reading about. That she could channel it into characters in different ways, and that she could make those characters just as real as the versions of her as Laura Petrie and Mary Richards that made us laugh, or that performed for us, like singing and dancing and hosting terrible dinner parties, famously. So I guess it was like a revelation to me of range and growth for her as an actor, and seeing all the things that she did after the Mary Tyler Moore Show. They seem to be very much about, at least from my perspective, right? Like doing things to challenge herself whether or not she got the kind of recognition that made her, world famous, like in her earlier roles. And she did amazing things. Like she was on Broadway in this role where she was playing someone who I believe was a quadriplegic or at least a paraplegic, and she was on stage every night, not moving, in a hospital bed. And I thought like how incredibly difficult that would be to like not use your body when you've been such a physical comedian. And so like it seemed about like challenging herself. And so maybe now I think a little bit that writing this book didn't exactly feel like a challenge while I was doing it, but it was doing something different for me in my, end of married years. And I like that, like taking new risks or trying something different. And she was certainly doing that in a role like the ordinary people role, but also just everything she went on to do between age 40 and 80, and her activism and her, just like her social commitments that came through in her life that I really admire. And for years and years, like I wanted to be a vegetarian. She was a vegetarian. Fred Rogers was a vegetarian. And finally I was like, why am I not living what I really believe in? These people were doing this. And so she also began to influence me in other ways that were beyond her character. And I think that that's like a gift that, other people give us as role models. So, so thank you for that question. I kind of went all over the place with it, but I don't know, Judy, do I have time to be answering these other questions? Is this
Sure,
okay?
go ahead. Kate had a question and we have time for that for sure.
Okay, let me see. I'm gonna scroll it up because it looks characteristically beautiful, Kate's writing. It is so heartening to classify our specific and sustained affections and obsessions as study. Oh, I feel that way too. Julie, do you feel that simply the existence of ekphrasis helps us see that a relationship we have to a music video or picture book or particular set of dance moves is not necessarily passive, shallow, receptive? Maybe receiving something deeply becomes in itself active and generative and expressive. Reception, like listening, staring, touching, or observation, may be a really dense, budding site of movement and autonomy. Well, yes, that's beautifully articulated. I do think and feel that way. And that, Emily Dickinson called them the flood subjects, right? Like the things that just like wash over us and, like the best sense of drowning us, like filling us and flooding us. And so I haven't written anything in quite such an elegant and lyric way to say that. But I think that that is what I feel, and what I want the other people to know is like you can have a really like beautiful relationship with something that the world doesn't necessarily classify as high art or art. Like I dislike those hierarchies a lot, because what really resonates with one person or becomes a flood subject for them doesn't have to be something that is well known to others. I mean, the Maritime Worship, of course, has become well known, but I think still like even there's some sensibility about like television, even in comparison to movies, as like the small screen, the little thing, the not as important thing. And I always am interested in what the underdog thing is, or the not as valued in the larger world thing is. But also you just have to follow where your flood subjects call you. And I do think that there's something about receptivity to them that's just it's so exciting. Like it isn't just passive, right? And also that word shallow is so important, because there's a sense of, like, oh, can you really write about like popular culture? Like, does that carry any weight? And it changes over time, or, people may not be able to access this in, 50 years. But I always think, well, we're here now. And so we got to live the now. And, if we want to quote Eliot, all is always now. So I feel like, we're wholly entitled to be in our now. Or Browning, the moment eternal. This is our now. So what we love now matters. And I think that receptivity is really maybe at the heart of all art making in general, and also all art making that responds to other art. So that makes me very happy. That's just a beautiful way to say it.
Thank you so much, Julie. I just put the website for Texas Review Press in the chat. So if you want to purchase the book right from the press, or you can find it at any bookseller under the Merry Years. And it's got this beautiful cover, beautiful graphics throughout. Is this Beaufort on the back? Is that a picture?
It's Tina. So I should
Oh,
say
okay.
the other thing that I really like, I only had, when you see this book, you're going to be astonished. And please remember, none of this was my idea except the wish for the 168 pages and famously, if you watch to the very end of the closing credits of every episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, there's an homage to the MGM lion. So talk about underdogs or undercats, right? MGM, right? It's like a giant lion roaring at the end of films on MGM. But at the end of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, they did this beautiful little homage, but also saying like, yeah, we're the undercats, but it's okay. Where it says MTM because it becomes MTM Enterprises, right? So she becomes actually really, and that's a whole other book, but how her show and her studio like supports all these other shows that start coming out on MTM on that series. But they have a little cat, a little orange cat, Mimsy, who's the MTM cat instead of the MGM lion. So instead of like roaring at the end, it goes like, and the good news of Mimsy is that she was a rescue cat who was brought onto the set to be filmed for that purpose, and then she was adopted by a staff member and lived out her whole life with someone from the crew of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So very, very important fate for Mimsy. And so I had this idea at the very beginning of the process where I was like, you know what I think we really need is a JMW at the end when you get to the end of the book, because and then it can be like my homage to MTM and their homage to MGM. So it keeps zeroing in. So this is Angie and I have two cats currently, and this is Tina, who is very much like, you know, that cat who knows she's the queen. You know, she's very like, if any cat should be in the hub of the wheel, it should be me. And so my sister-in-law, who has taken every author photo I've ever asked her to take and just a beautiful photographer, I gave her this picture actually that I had taken of Tina, and I said, do you think you could make it like a JMW logo? And she did. And then they took it from her and used it, which was incredible. And then they created all of the other like amazing art that is in the book, which is thrilling. But that all started because Kim Striegel made that for me. And then my publisher said, yes, we'll do it.
Wonderful. This is just a fantastic book in every way, and I know that everyone's looking forward to reading it who hasn't already and rereading it if you have. So thank you again, Julie, so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I do want to say to everyone in South Florida, who I recognize many of you are currently in South Florida, if you would like to come this Sunday to Books and Books at 5 p.m. in Coral Gables, I'm going to be reading different work from the book, not this work, but I am happily reading alongside Denise Duhamel, who's launching her new chapbook in Witch, and Jan Beatty, another amazing, amazing poet and longtime friend of Denise and somewhat longtime friend of mine, is coming down from Pittsburgh to read from her brand new poetry book, Drag Stripping. So if you're in the mood for like, I don't know, 3 feminist voices writing at this time, we will read and do a Q&A together and a signing on Sunday at 5.
Thank you. Fantastic opportunity. Thank
Thank
you
you so much.
everyone for being here tonight. We really appreciate it, and good luck with your reading on Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for coming, and maybe I'll see you in person. Maybe I'll see you in Minneapolis on Thursday.
Yeah, great.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.